So now everything we've been saying so far, well, actually, never mind. Let's finish this page here before. So, I guess I can stay with what I just said. So far, we've been talking about B cells. But it turns out that there are two flavors of B cells. Most of the B cells are what I think we've been talking about, just B cells. And they play an important role in adaptive immunity. This other flavor of B cells I'm about to tell you about, they're called B1 cells. Now, again, if it were up to me, I'd call the main B cells, the ones that are a lot longer, I'd call those the B1 cells. And these other little obscure B cells, I would call them the B2, but no. So the B cells that we've been talking about are actually now more properly called B2 cells. And this unusual kind of B cells, smaller numbers of them, are so-called B1. Now, the main B cells, which we now should probably call the B2 cells, their main role is, of course, adaptive immunity. They secrete antibodies to fight infection. The B1 cells are a more primitive kind of B cell. They probably arose earlier in evolution on the way to before we had evolved a proper B cell kind of thing. And these more primitive B1 cells, they are in many ways kind of more related to, in a way they're more related to innate immunity, basically. They don't generate all possible antibodies of all possibilities. They do make an IgM on their cell surface, but it uses just a very few, relatively V boxes. And when these B1 cells, these primitive B1 cells, when they create a gene for an IgM protein, they don't do the random insertion of nucleotides to generate all kinds of diversity. They use just these pre-made V boxes, basically. And they recognize just a few basic ligands, mostly the kinds of polysaccharides, for example, that you would find expressed on bacteria, but not on our cells. And they kind of will secrete these broadly reactive antibodies that will mostly react with bacteria, but maybe a little bit with us, with the cell, I don't know. They also express a protein on their surface called the CD5 protein. And the CD5 protein is a transmembrane protein, and it initiates signal transduction pathways that dampen down so if the cell has an IgM on its surface and it sees its cognate antigen, okay, it'll be activated and so forth. The CD5 protein dampens down all that activation, okay, and that's part because these CD1 cells, because they're sort of broad, their antibodies are sort of broadly cross-reactive. We don't want to be making tons of this stuff, and the CD5 protein will sort of dampen down the amount of antibody that we submit. So these B1 cells are also sometimes called CD5 B cells. The B1 cell, remember our main B cells, the B2 cells, they express IgM and IgD. The B1 cells just IgM, little if any IgD. Okay. Restricted diversity, as I was telling you, they bind polysaccharide and carbohydrate antigens of bacteria, but the antibodies that they produce have sort of a broad specificity, and they produce essentially low affinity but a wide variety. They have they're low affinity, but they bind to a wide variety of antigens. So B1 cells play a role in innate immunity. In adulthood, these B1 cells are able to proliferate outside of the bone marrow just by mitotic events. They are self-renewing. Remember, the regular B cells we're talking about, they live for a while and then they die, okay? And they can just be replaced from stem cell-derived precursors in the bone marrow. The B1 cells are started to be produced early in embryological development, and they can maintain their number just by mitosis. They are self-renewing. A lot of them are found in the peritoneal and pleural cavities. So the cavity in which our lungs sit, that's the pleural cavity, and the cavity where our gut stuff lies, that's the peritoneal cavity. And there are a lot of these B1 cells located there. Many chronic lymphocytic leukemias, CLL, are B1 cell derived. Okay. They're often successfully treated with radiation and bone marrow transplantation. And here's a little table that summarizes basically what we've been saying. You know, if I ask you questions about B1 cells, you'll just remember that they're sort of a little bit more primitive. They secrete sort of basically pre-made types of antibodies that recognize bacterial antigens. And I guess you should remember that when I say B cells, most of the time when we're talking about B cells, they're now more properly called the B2 cells. And there's these B1 cells, which are more primitive. So now then, remember we were talking about phase 1, 2, 3, 4, and so forth, and all up until now we were talking about phase 1, creation of a gene for an antibody molecule. And now we're going to talk about what was phase 2 in that little sort of table thing I showed you at the beginning. This was EG85, and it was, phase 1, 2, 3, 4. That's what I'm referring to. So phase 2 was then the elimination of self-reactive B cells in the bone marrow. If our B cell with its shiny new immunoglobulin N all over its surface, if it encounters self-antigen, now in the bone marrow, we have these special cells. These are bone marrow stromal cells here. And they make a little bit of almost all kinds of so they make a little bit of neuron protein, maybe a little bit of liver protein, all kinds of stuff like that. So if we encounter multivalent self-antigen expressed on the surface of one of these bone marrow cells here, this brand new B cell with its IgM, it gets signal transduction events, and in this environment, a signal transduction event means, well, go ahead and kill yourself right now, please, okay? And so it does. It shrivels up and dies, like programmed cell death, apoptosis. If it encounters all kinds of blood proteins, serum proteins, and so forth, soluble antigen and so forth, in the bone marrow, which will be, the blood is circulating in the bone marrow, so these B cells will encounter self-antigen, all the blood proteins and so forth. Okay. This is not a clustered multivalent presentation. It's more like individual IgMs will bind a protein here, and that doesn't lead immediately to programmed cell death. It makes this cell become, and the word is used here, is anergic. Okay? And the word anergic means basically like paralyzed. Okay? It can't do anything. Okay? And these anergic B cells, they then come into circulation, but they have the usual amount of immunoglobulin D on their surface, but much less IgM. Okay, and a B cell with mostly immunoglobulin D and little if any Ig, although won't be some IgM, but very little of it. That cell, when it gets into the lymph node, it's not going to gain access to survival factors, and it will die. Okay, so it dies to get the support that it needs. So and they say anergic B cells are kind of like dead man walking kind of thing. But if it doesn't encounter any self-antigens, if this is IgMs that don't recognize your own body proteins or antigens and so forth, then this is a good one. Okay, it's not going to recognize your own body as foreign and attack it. Okay, and so this becomes a mature naive B cell, and it turns on the expression of immunoglobulin D. Okay. So the difference seems to be here. Here we'll activate the splicing thing here, but the splice product is mostly immunoglobulin D and just a little IgM. Here it's mostly IgM and some IgD. Okay, now then. We're going to now go into much more detail about the events that occur to B cells when they enter a lymph node. We talked briefly about it in the first part of the course. Now, as promised, or threatened, we're going to go into a lot of detail. Okay, I mean, pretty much as bad as this detail we just now went through with Pro-B, Pre-B, all that stuff. Okay, so let's start off easy here. I said that you're making new B cells, some, I guess, 30 billion B cells are arriving in the blood from the bone marrow every day, and an equivalent number, equal number, are dying every day. Most of the ones, well, of these 30 billion that come into the blood, I think the large majority of them, or a large number of them, they die young. Okay, they die within a few days. I think here, what does it say here? Yeah, they die within a few days. Let's zoom in here. So, 30 billion B cells leave the bone marrow every day and enter the circulation. And 30 billion previously released B cells die. Okay. The majority of the newly released B cells fail to gain access to the primary lymphoid follicles and die within a few days. So all the B cells that are in circulation, either just emerged from the bone marrow or they've been around for some time now, they're always in a more or less sort of probability basis going to enter some lymph node in their circulation through the body pretty quickly. Maybe not the very first lymph node they encounter, maybe it'll be the 10th lymph node they encounter, but pretty soon they're going to, in a probabilistic way, they're going to do the diaphoresis thing here, leave the blood compartment, pass through the blood vessel cells here, the vascular endothelial cells, and come in to this blue-coated area, which is the T cell area of the lymph node. They will then try to gain access to this yellow area here, which is called the B cell area. In the B cell area, there are these FDC, follicular dendritic cells here. Now, I mentioned we're going to come into more detail about professional antigen presenting cells. Remember I said that professional antigen presenting cells are the B cells, the macrophages, and the dendritic cells. This is a different kind of dendritic cell. Okay, it's not the specialized antigen presenting cell. But it does present, it has a different developmental history. But it does express antigens on its surface, it can. But one of its main jobs here is to provide survival factors to B cells that make it into the B cell area. So the newly made B cells, they come into the T cell area, and they're not given access to the B cell area. Okay? That's because they don't have the right ratio of IgM and IgD, I guess, somehow. Okay? Since they fail to gain access to the B cell area, they fail to gain access to these follicular dendritic cells to get the survival factors they need, and so within a day or two they die. Okay. So most of these cells that live just for a couple of days, few days, they're probably cells that encountered soluble self-antigen in the bone marrow. They down-regulate expression of IgM. They have mostly IgD on their surface, and these are the cells that became anergic, and these are the cells that also then died pretty quickly here. So they have a delayed apoptotic death, basically. Okay. But and most of the cells that emerge from the bone marrow and are not anti-self, they have IgM and IgD on their surface. They do gain access, and they can then go ahead and live for as long as 1 or 2 months. That if they gain every time they, they do the tour of the body, back to the heart, tour of the body again, and on a regular basis, they do gain access to the FTC cells. Okay. Anergic IgD B cells are retained in the T cell area, and since they don't gain access to the FTCs, they die. Okay, so now let's take a look at what happens when one of these good B cells that's been around maybe for a month or two. Okay, what do I have to do here? So now we're on to phase 3 of that little sort of table of events. Phase 3 was the activation of B cells by foreign antigen in the lymph nodes. Okay. So if a B cell comes along and, oh my God, how exciting is this? I see my foreign antigen, okay? So whoopee, all right? So the B cell has come in and it encounters its foreign antigen. Now, it will encounter the foreign antigen may be a bacterial protein that has been carried by the lymphatic fluid into the lymph node, or it could be these antigen-presenting dendritic cells, which were at the site of infection and then migrated to the lymph node, and they're sitting there presenting their antigen now here. Because this is the T cell area, there's all kinds of T cells in here too, and there's a pretty good chance that this B cell that that binds the foreign antigen, and which will then bring it into itself and present peptides from that foreign antigen on its own MHC2 molecules. There'll be a CD4 T cell, which is also going to be now has become in this environment where we go from a CD4 T cell to a professional T helper 2 differentiated CD4 T helper 1 or T helper 2 cell, and it will then it can then recognize its MH2 molecules can then recognize the same peptides from the foreign antigen that the B cell is presenting, and therefore this is the one out of a million CD4 T helper cells that can give this B cell the second signal that it needs, okay? And it's going to then immediately it has what it needs and it will start to proliferate. So this one B cell, which saw its cognate antigen, proliferates It goes from 1 to 2 to 4 to 8 and so forth. We've got a little cluster of the clonal descendants of this one B cell that encountered this cognate antigen. Okay. This is called a primary focus of B cells. Okay. And some of these B cells here will directly become plasma cells, and they will start secreting IgM because we want to get some of that antibody into circulation right away. Okay. The antibody that's being secreted as soluble IgM, we may not have the highest affinity of that IgM, but remember it forms a pentamer when it's secreted, so it's got 10 binding sites, and one of them, or at least a few of them, are at any given moment binding the antigen or binding the surface of the bacterium, so that the avidity is high, and so that will then trigger the complement response and a number of other things that also can serve to facilitate the engulfment of bacteria. Not as well as IgG, but can help opsonize the bacteria. Okay, so some of these B cells, some of these clonal descendants are going to go ahead straight away and differentiate into IgM secreting plasma cells. Okay. The rest of them are going to come into the B cell area here. Okay. And they're going to get, again, the survival factors from these molecular dendritic cells here. And they're going to be proliferating here. And this is now, this yellow area here, in which the B cells are, the B cells, I should go to the next picture here. This B cell area here. So these B cells, they moved into the B cell area. Okay. There are a bunch of these B cell areas, and they're called lymphoid follicles. Okay. If there's no clusters of proliferating B cells, they're just called primary lymphoid follicles. But as soon as some of these B cells leave the primary follicle here, primary focus, and move into the B cell area and start to proliferate, then a primary lymphoid follicle, when it has this cluster of proliferating B cells, it becomes what we call a secondary lymphoid follicle. Okay. So these B cells move into a primary lymphoid follicle, proliferate, form of this is called the germinal reaction here. And this cluster of B cells turns this primary follicle into what we call a secondary follicle with a germinal center in it. Okay. So let's just go back for a moment to refer to this. These B cells, which got activated by their cognate antigen, and they got this T helper, CD4 T helper cell help. The cytokines that these CD4 T cells are also giving them. They're proliferating. Some of them go ahead and proliferate and then turn into plasma cells, reading IgM. The rest of them come into what was a primary follicle, and as they begin to proliferate, it becomes now a secondary follicle. And let me just sort of read here. So they proliferate briefly to form a primary focus. Some of the B cells in the primary focus differentiate into short-lived plasma cells, making low affinity antibody. These plasma cells migrate into this medullary cords, which I'm going to show you about in a moment, inside the lymph node. The rest of these B cells migrate into a nearby primary follicle, which changes its morphology to become a secondary follicle. Okay. Now, I'm going to go through this sort of very busy annotated picture here and just try to follow along. But again, once again, I have provided you the perfect lecture note where I'm going to say here in the next 10 or 15 minutes. Okay, on the next page in your notes, page 9B. And because I'm a kind person, I'm just going to tell you one of the questions, like a pointer or so, maybe more, on the second exam is going to be this, okay? So you're going to on the test you're going to see B cells in the blood enter a lymph node across the endothelial barrier to form a, and then here instead of saying high endothelial evangel, that'll be a blank. And you're going to have to write in there high endothelial evangel. And then you continue to read here. It then encounters this cognate activated blank T helper cell. Now, I've underlined some things here, and it's not like wherever you see something that's underlined or something, that's where it's going to be blank. But you're going to have to know all this. I'm going to give you, just to make life easy for you again, because I'm a kind person, I'm going to give you a vocabulary thing. I'm going to give you, so up here you'll see like 15 words or phrases. So you're going to, you just have to recognize the correct, yeah, right. Oh yeah, that slots into here. And so I'm making it as easy as I can. It's still going to be a burdensome kind of high school level memorization kind of question. But if you go to medical school or physician assistant school, you're going to get this kind of high school. I mean, believe me, it's memorization of the wazoo. So anyway, this will just keep your memorizing capacity and training here. So this is what I'm going to be telling you, but let's go through it together and look at the picture. Oh, by the way, I'm also in this foreign exam, this question I'm promising to give you. I'm going to show you a picture, basically this picture, and I'm going to ask you to identify. So I'm going to have up here again, I'm going to have a little set of vocabulary words up here, so to speak. One of them is going to be primary focus, okay? Next one is going to be secondary follicle. Next one is going to be, I don't know, germinal center. And then I'm going to have various lines pointing to the various ATB and all that kind of stuff. And you're going to, so there's going to be a line pointing to the high endothelial evangel, and then a little space here where you can write in high endothelial evangel. Okay? And you're going to have the names up again, giving you the names up on top. Okay? And you're going to identify from the given vocabulary words or whatever words up here, the various items and components of it. Because I'm a kind person. You'll be cursing me after the second exam, but I tell you, I could be cruel, much more cruel than I am. Okay, so let's go through it. My daughter, by the way, got into physician assistant school. She's now a practicing physician assistant. And one time she was here visiting, and she said, I think it was this class, and she said, "You're way too kind to them, Dad." So you may not think I am, but I am. All right. Okay. So here's the high endothelial evangel, and the B cells come across this. Also, the T cells also cross in here. They're all going to be sniffing around in here. And one of these B cells, oh God, my cognate antigen. How exciting, okay? And so that B cell starts the process of starting to get ready to start proliferating. It can only fully start proliferating when it gets help from the CD4 T cells here, which are going to be giving it, here's the T cell that it's giving the cytokines for this B cell to proliferate. Some of these B cells activated and proliferating, we're going to go ahead and differentiate into short-lived plasma cells, and these are the little finger-like, dark finger-like extensions here. These are the medullary cords. So here's one of these dark fingers here. That's a medullary cord. And this plasma cell just kind of sit here and secrete the IgM into the lymphatic fluid that is bathing through this thing. And here is the exiting, the efferent lymphatic vesicle. So I'm going to have in the test a little arrow pointing to this, and instead of saying efferent lymphatic vesicle, this one is going to be blank. And up here you're going to find the word efferent lymphatic vesicle, just to remind you, and you're going to write in efferent, and you're going to have to remember the difference between afferent lymphatic vesicle and efferent. Efferent is exiting, E for exiting, efferent vesicle. So all the IgM, and some of these plasma cells will actually come on up here and just go to the location of the bone marrow to secrete. But the first ones, the IgM, they just stay here secreting the IgM. And the rest of these B cells, they then migrate into what was a primary lymphatic lymphoid vesicle, lymphoid follicle, that had nothing going on. And as soon as they come into this primary lymphoid follicle and start to proliferate, okay, then this turns into a secondary follicle. So here are two secondary follicles in which we have this cluster of proliferating B cells and dendritic cells and CD4 T cells, T helper cells, all going on here. And when you get an infection, there's a lot of this, and the whole lymph node swells dramatically. So when I was a little boy, I didn't want to go to school. I would say, I don't feel good. I think I should stay home. My mother would sort of look under here and did you feel this? If I had any swollen glands, as she would call them, okay? Look for the lymph nodes here, okay? And if I had swollen glands, I'd say, all right, I'll just so these lymph nodes swell because of these secondary lymphatic follicles with germinal centers in them. And this whole process which we describe it here is called the germline reaction here. So these B cells, when they come in here, they're going to encounter they're going to, because they're proliferating, remember I told you a little bit earlier that proliferating cells tend to be larger than non-proliferating cells. So these are somewhat larger cells, okay? And these somewhat larger cells here, more or less in the center of this structure, they're called centroblasts. Okay? So the centroblasts are here, and they are large proliferating B cells. Now, another name for the, let's see, I think I have this here. Well, there's a little bit of a semantic thing here. Proliferating white blood cells in general are called lymphoblasts as a sort of general category name for them. Okay, these particular cells, they are a type of lymphoblast, but they're called centroblasts. Okay, because they're found in the center of this reaction of this structure here, and this region of this structure is called the dark zone. These are called germinal centers here. Let me say that. Yes. The secondary lymphoid follicle has a germinal center in it. And a germinal center is this whole structure here is a germinal center. Okay, so the presence of a germinal center, i.e. this whole business right here, is what makes this follicle a secondary follicle as opposed to an empty primary lymphoid follicle. And so we speak about dark zone and a light zone of a germinal center. And these lymphoblasts are in the dark zone here. Okay. Now then, in these centroblasts, this is where we're going to mutate the variable region of that IgM that we had created. This is the process I tell you it's called somatic hypermutation. Okay? We're going to take that IgM that had been created and was being expressed by this B cell. We're going to mutate the region of the variable BDR part that we had created at such cost to slaughter of B cells that couldn't do it and so forth. It was good enough, but we're going to make it better. So we're going to induce mutations in that nucleotide sequence. And most of the mutations are going to be much worse than the original one that we had. But some of them are going to be actually give you a higher affinity, tighter binding IgM antibody. Okay? So that's what's going on with somatic hypermutation. Okay? Now these cells here undergoing somatic hypermutation, and this is the proliferate for a certain number of doublings. Okay? But then they're going to migrate out towards the periphery here, where they're going to encounter these follicular dendritic cells. Remember, the follicular dendritic cells, they give you these survival factors and so forth. Remember, the anergic B cells that were self-reactive, they couldn't get access to the B cell area, so they couldn't get to these follicular dendritic cells. But now these centroblasts, after they've gone through the requisite number of doublings to create, I don't know, a couple hundred clonal descendants. Okay, well, clonal descendants now are mutant versions of the original B cell, right? Some of them, most of them, making much worse IgM than they had to begin with. But some of them, it's all very Darwinian. Okay, some of them are really going to be good. Okay, and so now they're going to compete for binding to the follicular dendritic cells. And the story I tell here is that I have spent time in England and I have spent time in Italy. Both nations have their charms. Okay, I'm a little more partial to England, but I really appreciate Italy. And in England, especially I remember from my boyhood, when, for example, the ice cream truck would come out to the neighborhoods, although they didn't have ice cream trucks in England in those days, but anyway, something desirable for the children. And the little English children, they will wait their turn in line until they give the money and get the line. Whereas in the same situation in Italy, it's devil take the hindmost. Okay. It's a little hellish. It's a little child Warcraft world going on there. Well, it's Italy here. Okay, when it comes to getting access to the follicular dendritic cells, it's devil take the hindmost. Okay, and if one of these mutant descendant B cells has a really tight affinity, he gets to hold on good tight. He's holding on and he's holding on, and he's getting his survival factors. And the other ones are trying to pull him off, but they can't, So he survives. That's that old rhythm and blues song, "Only the Strong Survive." He survives, okay? He survives because he has a tighter binding IgM than any of the other mutant siblings of his, okay? And so now then, also here in the peripheries, we're having selected for the B cell descendant that has now the mutated, really high affinity version of the original IgM. All the other brothers and sisters, they die, okay? It's a hard world, but that's the way it goes. Now, also out here, we have we have more T helper cells. Remember, we had some T helper cells here, and these cells to grow. Out here, we have T helper cells that they have been instructed by the innate immune response, the macrophages and so forth, and the antigen, the follicular, the antigen-presenting dendritic cells. These are smart cells. Over the course of millions of years of evolution, they have evolved so that these innate responding macrophages, for example, and so forth, they are sending cytokine signals that say, okay, what we have here is a helminth, okay? And the best way to fight this guy is with IgE, okay? So these B cells with now the highest affinity, they're also getting instructed about what class switching then to do. to go from IgM to IgE because it was a worm, okay? Or to go to IgG because it was a bacteria, or maybe to IgA because it was something that came in maybe through the gut or something like that. Okay? So these cells, so we have the large centroblasts where we have somatic hypermutation, and that's in the dark zone here. And then these centroblasts become centrocytes out here in the periphery. These are smaller cells, okay? And these centrocytes are small, non-dividing cells, and they're now going to be competing for the ice cream cones and so forth, and a little slugfest that's going on here. And only the strong survive here. The FDC cells, liquid dendritic cells, they give factors that, for example, increase the production of an anti-death protein called BCLX cell, okay, which blocks programmed cell death, for example, in addition to survival factors other than this. Okay. So the best of the centrocytes with the best somatic mutation here, they move out into the periphery here, and they present their antigen to T helper cells. And these T helper cells, they have been informed by the macrophages and antigen presenting dendritic cells as to what the pathogen is, and they're therefore releasing these cytokines have instructed these T helper cells what kind of cytokines to then give the centrocyte B cells, okay? And so therefore they'll do the proper class switching. Okay? So these centrocytes, which have the highest affinity antibody, but they're still IgM, are now going to do class switching under the instruction of these CD4 T cells, which in turn had been instructed by the innate immune response, basically. Okay? So now we'll get class switching, okay, or otherwise known as isotype switching. So we'll go from IgM to IgG or IgE or whatever. Okay? What in the world did I do? I freaked out the machine. Okay. So these. What? Maybe if I just touch iris here, and that'll calm it down. With epileptic seizures. Let's see, maybe we just turn off the light and then reboot. When in doubt, reboot. I don't really trust it, but anyway, let's continue on here. So we have the centrocytes, which have been, by somatic hypermutation, we selected the highest affinity IgM. And now it's going to be class switched, okay? And those high affinity class switched B cells are now, again, most of them are going to become then plasma cells, secreting the high affinity class switched antibody. But some of them are not going to go the plasma cell route. They're going to stay not as high affinity class switched B cells, and they're going to turn, their differentiation is to become a memory B cell. So now we have memory B cells, which have been instructed all to have been, they're now high affinity against this pathogen. They've been class switched, which is to produce the best antibody to fight this antigen, okay? And they're memory cells, which can live for years, okay? These plasma cells, they're going to fight the present enemy right here and now. They're going to fight that, and then having won the battle, their reward is to go away quietly and kill themselves, okay? Tough noogies, but you have your memory B cell brethren who will live on to fight again another day. Okay, well that's all of what is summarized then here. Okay. And this is, you're going to have to be able to fill in the blanks when I give you this page of text. here's a little more detail. This is more detail than maybe you need to know. Here's a this is a cartoon version here of this terminal center. Here are the central blasts. What's happening inside the central blasts? High somatic hypermutation. And then after they finish somatic hypermutation, they move up into this region here. This was the dark zone, although it's kind of lighter in this cartoon. This is the dark zone, and this is the light zone where the centrocytes are. And the centrocytes are now, wrestling and fighting to get access to the survival factors, ice cream cones and so forth. The winner is there, and they then get instructed out here to do class switching, and to become, and their fate is decided as to whether they're going to fight the battle now, become plasma cells, or go into seclusion and be memory cells. Here we've seen the dendritic cells, which are all up in here. So central blasts here are kind of lymphoblasts. Lymphoblast is a general name for proliferating cells. Let's see. I should have been talking my whole head. Slide the gently into the plane of focus. The dendritic cells are going to be presenting antigen to CD4 T cells, and they're going to become differentiated into T helper cells. And the particular cytokines that this dendritic cell is going to be producing, or in turn, was instructed by it knows what kind of a pathogen this was. So it's telling this cell to become a T helper 1 or a T helper 2 cell, and even more information as to whether it's a T helper 2 cell, let's say, that's going to be best in instructing the B cells to class switch to IgA. So now this T helper cell here is going to then give this T cell, which is now have a high affinity antibody, and it's presenting peptides here, the CD4 T helper cell here. We're going to give it instructions to go ahead and become a plasma cell, and also class switching is going to happen first here. Okay. So here we're going to get the class switching here of the centers of the centrocytes. Okay. I beg your pardon. This shows the first part of the primary focus. I'm sorry. This is the primary focus where the T helper cells are going to tell the cell to proliferate. Okay. And then move to the primary follicle, maybe the secondary follicle. And then in the dark zone here in the germinal center, as a central blast, we'll get somatic hypermutation. Okay. The mutants with low affinity, they don't get any goodies or die. The high affinity IgM is able to stay getting the goodies from the proliferative dendritic cell. And then down here, it will then get more information from the helper T cell about related to class switching. Okay. And comments early here, because this is the last thing we're going to say on this topic. This is the end of the chapter 4 material, but I'm not sure what chapter it is in the newest edition of your book, whatever. This is a little table here that talks about different kinds of cancers that have their origin in particular cells in this whole pathway that we've been talking about here. So we already said chronic CLL, chronic lymphocytic leukemia. That's a cancer which has its origin in these more primitive B1 B cells here, and these they are proliferating in the blood. That's a leukemia. Okay. The lymphoid progenitor cell here, which is essentially a stem cell, if that becomes cancerous, that gives a kind of leukemia called acute lymphocytic leukemia, otherwise known as ALL. Okay. And these cancers, they proliferate in the bone marrow and in the blood. Okay. A mutation in one of these, remember we go from stem cell to pro-B, pre-B. One of these pre-B cells becomes cancerous. That's just called a pre-B cell leukemia, and it's also found in the bone marrow and the blood. That's because of these cells are here. If we have a Burkitt's lymphoma, okay, or other kinds of follicular center cell lymphomas, these are cancerous cells, cancers of the mature B cell here, and they proliferate in the lymph nodes, okay, and or I beg your pardon, in the periphery. And in fact, a marker for well, never mind. They proliferate by periphery we mean the lymph nodes here. So that's why they're called lymphomas, because they're the lymph nodes basically. So that's the cell of origin for Burkitt's lymphoma. And then there's a kind of what we call Waldenstrom's macroglobulinemia. This is an overproliferation of an IgM secreting B cell. Okay, these kinds of cancers, and then finally the multiple myeloma cancer cells. Remember we talked about monoclonal antibodies, and we take a myeloma cell and fuse it with a B cell. And one of the things we have to do is take that myeloma cell. This myeloma cell is a mutation of a plasma cell, basically, or a cell, an immediate precursor to a plasma cell. So it is secreting IgM, okay, a ton of it. And one of the reasons that myeloma, these kinds of cancers, one of the reasons that contributes to cell death is that the concentration of IgM antibody in your blood becomes so high that your blood becomes kind of viscous with it, and your kidneys get clogged up and so forth. Also, multiple myeloma, these things tend to stick to the bone, and there's something about the bone part that they like, and they proliferate on the bone, and they sort of eat their way through the bone, so you get lots of fractures and so forth. Yeah. So anyway, often people realize they have multiple myeloma sometimes because they get a fracture, and it's an unusual amount of fracture that the doctor's already. We should take an X-ray, okay, and then in the X-rays they can see all the little spots of the myeloma cancer all over the bone. So different types of B cells reflect B cells at different stages of development. Tumors retain the characteristics of the cell type in which they arose. Tumors from mature-naive B cells grow on the follicles of the lymph nodes. Plasma cell tumors grow in the bone marrow. Anyway, that's all. I don't think I have any questions about this material. You all check to make sure. Okay, we have survived.